So we've got two quite different lectures from different colleges. And without further ado, we're going to kick off with Sarah Seaton. When will my baby go home? Examining length of stay neonatal care. So Sarah, would you please give us your doctoral inaugural lecture? Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. And if I wasn't feeling nervous before, suddenly being told that I now have to inspire every PhD student that's starting today has definitely filled me with absolute dread. But hopefully, if nothing else, this will show you that it is possible to complete a PhD and get to the end of it. And hopefully, I'll be able to answer my question by the end of this of when will my baby go home. So every year in England, there's around 650,000 to 700,000 babies born. And of these babies, a very small amount, less than 1%, which I've indicated in black on this graph, are born very preterm. And what I mean by this is babies that have been born 2 or more months earlier than they should have been. Now, it's quite hard to imagine what these babies look like if you haven't seen one before and appreciate really how small they are. Now, in the centre of these photographs, I provided a photograph of Caleb, my nephew, who was born earlier this year. Now, Caleb was born at 40 weeks, which is the normal length of a pregnancy. However, the photographs around the outside are of babies that have been born very preterm. So you can see a photograph of Alec, who was born at 23 weeks. That means he was born over 4 months sooner than he should have been. Samuel and Caleb, who were born at 29 weeks, so they were born around 3 months earlier than they should have been. And Donovan, who was born at 31 weeks, so he was born about 2 months earlier than he should have been. Now, in each of these photographs, I've attempted to pick photographs where there's adults' hands in the photograph, so you can understand the scale of how small these babies are. So, for example, you can see really how small Alec is in that photograph with his mother's hand holding him. And just another thing to point out, so I'm holding Caleb there, and he's less than 24 hours old at that point. But most of the photographs around the outside, the babies are several days old, and this is the first time the parents have actually got to hold them, because when these babies have initially been born, they've been so fragile and so small, the parents haven't been able to hold them. So I hope this helps explain how small these babies are that I'm going to be talking about throughout this presentation. Now, after these babies have been admitted, they make a very sick group. So if they survive the initial period after birth, they'll be admitted for neonatal specialist care, and this can last for quite a long time. Parents often say that their 2 main questions after their baby has been admitted is, will my baby survive? And then, when will my baby go home? Now, there's been a lot of research that's looked at will my baby survive, and actually, over the last 10 to 20 years or so, the survival rates of very preterm babies have improved dramatically. It's still the risk of mortality is still quite high in some of the groups of the very preterm, and I will mention this in a little while. However, the question, when will my baby go home, has received far less attention in the research. What parents always tell me when I speak to them about this is what they're told is, your baby will go home around the date they were due to be born. And every parent tells me that they always remember the due date of their child. It's one of these dates that's ingrained in a mother and father's minds. And actually, there's absolutely no evidence to suggest whether or not saying this is true. No one knew before my PhD started whether or not these babies did go home around the date they were due to be born, so it's not clear whether this is helpful to say at all. So when I started my PhD, I did a review to look at who'd actually looked at how to estimate length of stay in neonatal care. And over the 20 years before my PhD started, there'd been about 8 papers published. 2 of those papers were from my research group, so it hadn't been a very well-researched area. But what people had typically done is they'd looked at babies that were born, and then they'd very simply counted the number of days until that baby was discharged. And they provided it perhaps as an average or some other estimate like that. What was a little bit more unclear was what to do about those babies that died during their time in neonatal care. Now, in this population, I have said survival has improved quite a lot, but especially for babies born at 23, 24 weeks, the percentage that die can still remain quite high. And so there was a bit of uncertainty about what should you do about this group of babies. Some researchers had included them in the estimates, some had excluded them, and there was no real clarity about what you should do. If you do include them all together, it's not clear if this is a very sensible thing to do. So on this graph, what I've presented is the length of stay for babies according to whether they survived to discharge or whether they died during their time in neonatal care. So you can see from the black hollow bars, this is the length of stay of the babies that died during their time in neonatal care. So you can see that over 15% of them will only survive for 1 day, and they'll all only survive quite a short period of time. But if you look at the babies that survive until they're discharged home, so that's the green bars on my graph, you can see that the green area doesn't start to appear until around 20 days after birth, so they'll be in hospital for at least 20 days. But you can see that that green area continues for a very long period of time, sometimes in excess of 100 days. So actually, I'm a statistician, but it doesn't take a statistician to understand that the shape of these two estimates of length of stay are really quite different from each other. So they probably need to be considered separately and not together as if they're the same thing. So my PhD proposed that we could use an alternative statistical technique, which is known as competing risks. Now, I'm sure you'll all be delighted to hear that I'm not going to talk statistics at you, and there's no formulas, there's nothing here. If you're interested, you can come talk to me afterwards, and I'll provide you with all the detail, or you can read my thesis. But for now, I'll just describe it as this diagram. So a baby is born, and now one of two things can happen to the baby. The baby can die during their time in neonatal care, or they can be discharged home. And we measure the time until one of these events occur. For those that are interested, the reason it's called competing risk methodology is because the two or more events have to compete for attention. And once one has occurred, the other can't occur. So I'm sure you can all see, once you've been discharged home from neonatal care, you can't die in neonatal care. And once you've died in neonatal care, you can't be discharged home. So to provide you with some results. So this is for babies born at 24 weeks. You can see up the y-axis, so up the vertical axis, the percentage ranging from 0 to 100%. And along the x-axis on the bottom, you can see the days since birth, from day 1 to day 150, which is where I've cut this off. So that's just less than 6 months. Now, some of these babies do stay in hospital for longer than 6 months, but it's quite unusual, which is why I've cut off my graph at that point. Just to explain the different colours. So black represents the babies that have died during their time in neonatal care. The dark grey represents those babies that have been discharged from neonatal care. And the light grey represents those that remain in the neonatal unit. Now, the easiest way to understand these graphs is for me to talk you through an example. So if we select a time point, so for example, here I've selected 60 days. So 60 days after birth, we can see that the black area extends to around 38%, just under 40%. So I've drawn the dotted line so you can see that on the y-axis there. And we can see that there's no dark grey area at all. So what this means is 38% of babies born at 24 weeks have died by day 60. And the rest of the babies, the 62%, remain in the neonatal unit, which I've highlighted with the blue arrow there. There's no dark grey area because absolutely no babies born at 24 weeks have gone home before 60 days of life. Just to pick another area, another point in time to explain a little bit more. So here I've selected 120 days after birth. You can see that the black area now extends to just slightly below 40%. So the percentage of babies that have died has not increased much more since what I showed you at 60 days. However, now you can see that a dark grey area has started to appear. And we can see that a percentage of babies have now been discharged home from the neonatal unit. However, at 120 days, we can still see that there's still quite a substantial number, probably about 33% of babies born at 24 weeks who remain in the neonatal unit. In fact, for 24-week babies, we can see that right down at 150 days, where I've cut my graph off, a small percentage of these babies still remain in the neonatal unit, even 150 days after they've been born. So the nice thing about these graphs is we can produce them for each week of gestational age. So I've started with 24 weeks, which is those babies that have been born 4 months too early. And we can produce this plot for each week of gestational age, and we can see how these different probabilities change over time. So for example, as I go from 24 to 25 weeks, we can see that there's a really dramatic reduction in the percentage of babies that die during their time in neonatal care. So on the previous slide, it was around 40%, and you can see now that actually it's leveled off at around 20%. So if babies born at 25 weeks, about 80% will survive and around 20% will die during their time in neonatal care. The dark grey area, which is representing the babies that are discharged home from neonatal care, starts to occur sooner and sooner as the weeks of gestational age increase. And you can see this as I go through the different weeks of gestational age. So as I go to 26, 27, 28, 29, 30 and 31. So you can see by the time we get to 31 weeks that that black area is really quite small. So in this group of babies, the percentage of mortality is around 2%. So it's still not insubstantial, but it's a lot lower than the 40% of those babies that were born at 24 weeks. Now you can see that the dark grey area starts to appear around day 10. So these babies are going home from around 10 days of life. So this explains those early discharges we saw on that graph that I showed you later. These babies are going home from around day 10. And you can see that if you look at 150 days on this, all those babies have either died or been discharged from the neonatal unit long before 150 days after they've been born. So I hope those graphs help explain a little bit of what I'm trying to show. However, it's not so easy from those graphs to understand the answer to my question of, do babies go home by their due date? So what I produced here is a table of some of the estimates which are produced from those graphs. So what I've given you is for each week of gestational age, from 24 to 31 weeks, I've said approximately how many days that baby had remaining until they were due to be born, what their average length of stay was, and a way that we might want to phrase the estimate of this length of stay. So for example, for babies born at 24 weeks, these babies had around 112 days remaining until the date they were actually due to be born. But they stayed in hospital for around 123 days, and I would suggest perhaps we could say that that's around 4 or 5 months. For babies born at 25 weeks, these babies had around 105 days remaining until they were actually due to be born, and their average length of stay is around 107 days. So for this group of babies, actually saying that these babies will go home around their due date is perhaps not unreasonable. However, 25-week babies are a very small part of the babies born at 24 to 31 weeks. Now, the babies born at 31 weeks, this is the largest group of babies born at less than 32 weeks. Now, these babies had around 63 days remaining until they were due to be born, and the median length of stay for these babies is around 34 days. So you can see that in this group of babies, actually they're going home quite a lot sooner than their due date. So when their parents are being told you'll be going home around your due date, what's actually happening is they're going home quite a lot earlier. Now, I'm not suggesting that you should use these estimates to replace the phrase you'll be going home by your due date. So for example, if we've got a 25-week baby, like 24-week baby is a better example, within the neonatal unit, I'm not suggesting that the clinician should say to the mother, your baby will be here for 123 days, because that's incredibly precise and likely to be wrong. So that's why I provided some estimates on the right-hand side of ways that I think might be more useful of saying it. So the clinician needs to use their judgment, of course, about whether this is an appropriate thing to do. But, for example, for the babies born at 31 weeks, I'd suggest that rather than saying they'll go home around their due date, it's perhaps more appropriate to say baby may be here for around a month. Interestingly, if you haven't had a baby in neonatal care, you might think that surely it's a good thing to be told your baby's going home in around 63 days and then have them go home in 34. I mean, surely it's a wonderful thing to leave the neonatal unit early and get home sooner. However, there's a whole body of evidence about how these parents find it really quite hard to be prepared for when their child's going home. They speak about being unprepared and not ready for the discharge of their child. And so when it occurs much sooner than they expect, it can actually be quite traumatic for them. One of the parents involved in my parent panel actually summed this up quite nicely, and so I've provided this quote of something she said to me. All along, we'd been told we'd be home by her due date. Then we were told she was going home in 2 days, which was a month earlier than her due date. We were completely unprepared. We didn't have anything at home. I'd been too petrified to buy anything. We had to say no to allow us a day to go to IKEA. Now, obviously, this is a parent of a 31-week baby. She hadn't been expecting her baby to be born for another 9 weeks. She hadn't gone and bought the cot from IKEA, and she hadn't got everything ready at home. And then suddenly she'd had a preterm birth, and she'd been told your baby will go home around the due date. And she thought, I've got 60 days to get ready. And then suddenly the clinician said, no, you're going home in 2. So there was this dramatic scramble to get everything ready. So I hope this proves the point that actually there's probably just as much harm done by telling someone a date further in the future and then bringing it forward than by underestimating as well. So I wrote this paper up, and we recently had it published in Archives of Disease in Childhood, which is a reasonable journal within my field. It was, if ever there was a time to show off, I guess this is it. So it was selected by Archives and suggested that this was an important paper for everyone to read if they wanted to keep up with the neonatal research field that month. So I was quite pleased about that. It's now being used in some neonatal units throughout the country. So on the left-hand side, you can see a table that this neonatal unit have, where it says the week of gestational age that a baby's born at, and then the estimated time until they're due to be discharged. So the estimates on this table from 24 to 31 weeks are taken from my study. And what they do is they calculate an estimated discharge date for a baby. They use some clinical knowledge, of course, because you need to use that as well as what I'm provided. And then they put it on their whiteboard of when they're expecting this baby to go home. So when I started this section, I explained that we can use this method known as computing risks to consider both babies that have died and babies that have been discharged home from the neonatal unit. So we can consider both the questions that parents are interested in after their baby's been admitted. However, in reality, life in the neonatal unit is far more complicated than this. So, for example, I told you that 25-week babies spend around 105 days in the neonatal unit. Well, what happens during those 105 days? A lot of different things are occurring. So in 2011, which was just before the start of my PhD, the British Association of Perinatal Medicine released guidance on the different categories of care that exist within neonatal medicine. And broadly, there are 3 levels of care that exist that a baby can receive, and these are according to the type of treatments that a baby needs. So there's intensive care, which is the care provided to the sickest babies and those that are the most fragile. Most of these babies will need help with breathing and will be on some kind of ventilator. High dependency care, these babies are less sick, but still not very well. And so in this photograph here, you can see that Donovan has got a tube up his nose, which is helping him with feeding. And so this is the kind of care you'll be receiving if you're receiving high dependency care. And then finally, special care. So this is babies that are doing a fair bit better, but still need a little bit of help. And a common thing that you'll need when you're receiving special care is phototherapy, which is what Donovan's doing, having a nice little sunbathe under a phototherapy lamp there. Now, each of these levels of care obviously have massive implications for the baby, according to the treatment they're receiving, but they also have big implications for the NHS. So, for example, for intensive care, theoretically, there should be 1 nurse allocated to a baby receiving intensive care. There should be 1 nurse for every 2 babies receiving high dependency care, and 1 nurse for every 4 babies. 1 nurse for every 4 babies receiving special care. There's also differences in cost, and it's important to consider this from a resource perspective of what we need to staff a neonatal unit. So I can extend my diagram. So this is a different statistical technique now, known as multi-state modelling. Again, I'm not going to provide you with any of the detail, but you can see in this diagram these original boxes that I had that state born, died, and discharged home. What I've done this time, though, is I've expanded the time spent in hospital into the different levels of care: intensive care, high dependency care, and special care. And I've provided arrows which indicate different pathways and different routes which you can take through your time in hospital. So, for example, a baby might be born at 24 weeks. It might require help breathing for quite a while, maybe a few weeks, so the baby will be receiving intensive care. As the baby starts to improve, perhaps it will be possible to take them off the ventilator, but perhaps, like in my photographs, they might still need some kind of help with their feeding, so they'll be receiving high dependency care. And then finally, as they start to improve a bit more, they might need special care, perhaps just some form of observations before they go home, or phototherapy, or something a little bit more basic. And then ultimately, this baby's discharged home. So you can follow that pathway through the journey of patient care by following the orange arrows that I've highlighted here. Now you'll notice that there isn't an arrow between every box on the diagram. So I haven't provided an arrow between intensive care and discharge home, and I haven't provided an arrow between high dependency care and home. This isn't to say this doesn't happen. So this, for example, would be a baby who is ventilated, who is discharged home on a ventilator. It does happen very rarely, and usually represents babies that are being discharged home for palliative care. So I didn't consider this in my thesis, although I did help a charity Together for Short Lives when they were updating a guidance document that they had to do with perinatal pathways for babies with palliative care needs. So this is more or less the graph I showed you earlier. I told you about the black area representing the percentage of babies that have died during their time in neonatal care, the dark grey area representing those that have been discharged home, and the light grey area representing those that remain in the neonatal unit. So what we can do now is we can colour in this light grey area to indicate what type of care these babies are receiving. So the dark blue area here indicates intensive care, the medium blue represents high dependency care, and the light blue represents special care. So we can see that if a baby's born at 24 weeks that are in the neonatal unit, the first few days of life will all be intensive care. After around 10 days, the high dependency care area will start to appear as these babies become a little bit more well, and perhaps they can cope just with high dependency care. And then finally, the special care area, which starts to appear between day 40, but mainly by day 50, as these babies continue to improve, and the ones that remain in the neonatal unit now need special care. Now, you can see for the babies born at 24 weeks that the vast majority of the care they're receiving is intensive care and high dependency care, by the fact that the biggest area is the dark blue and the medium coloured blue. If we look at the other end, though, and the baby's born at 31 weeks, so this is the group of babies where around 98% of them will survive to be discharged home, and my estimates were saying they'll be going home in around a month. And again, we can fill in this area. So you can see that for babies born at 31 weeks, the vast majority of the care that they're requiring is special care. there's actually a very small percentage of them that need intensive care at all. And so most of them, the month or so they will spend in hospital will be spent receiving special care. Now, all good PhDs still have a few unanswered questions at the end of them. So for those of you that are starting your PhDs today, don't think you're going to answer them all, because you're not. And mine was no different from that, I guess. So what I was interested in towards the end of my PhD was whether or not there were differences across the country in terms of length of stay. Now, everyone's interested in whether there's differences in NHS provision depending on where you live, and I was interested in this as well. So what I decided to do was compare the area of the country with the shortest length of stay with the area of the country with the longest length of stay, and see if I could understand why these differences occurred. So this is just an example. So for babies born at 29 weeks, the black area represents the area of the country with the shortest length of stay, and the grey area represents the area of the country with the longest length of stay. Now you can see that in both those areas of the country, the number of days of intensive care they receive is exactly the same on average. And you can see that for special care, it's more or less exactly the same on average. But there seems to be some kind of difference going on here about the provision of high dependency care. And the area of the country with the longest length of stay provides on average around 5 days more high dependency care than the area of the country with the shortest length of stay. I don't have an answer for this, to be honest, at the moment, and I'm also not entirely sure whether there's really a problem here, or whether actually the longest length of stay is actually the best approach to have, the shortest length of stay is the best approach to have. So I finished my PhD with this question mark about what should we do about the different areas of the country. So I'm going to finish off my lecture just how I began, with some photographs of some babies. So I provided this photograph for you at the start. This is Alec, who was born at 23 weeks. Now for these babies, those that survive to discharge often go on to have health problems throughout their entire lives, and it's quite unclear still at the moment what impact their initial neonatal length of stay has on them throughout childhood. So for example, would we be better off keeping them in hospital for a little bit longer? Maybe then they'd come back into hospital less as they got older. We really don't know what happens to them after the initial neonatal period. However, just to provide you with some happiness to finish off, this is Alec on his first day of preschool, so he's now doing well. And I think it's fair to say that all of the parents that are involved in my research would describe their children as being incredible, happy, bouncy children, despite some of the problems that some of them may face. Some of them would even describe their children as superheroes. And here's Wonder Woman, Sophie. I'd like to finish off with some thank yous. So I've got to give a huge, massive thank you to my supervisors, Brad, Liz and Keith, for helping me throughout my PhD. My data for my PhD came from the Neonatal Data Analysis Unit, and I was funded by the National Institute for Health Research. And then finally, I'd like to thank Bliss, which is one of the major baby charities in my area, and I'd like to thank all the parents that helped me with my work. Thank you.
Really good start. We do have a couple of minutes, so you're not going to get away scot-free. Does anybody have any brief questions they'd like to ask? Please?
Yeah, well, I think that the work is brilliant, and I think that it has lots of applications in terms of like, I mean, I'm not familiar at all with the field, but I would imagine that, providing this information in terms to hospital administrations and to, like that kind of institutions, in order for them to actually set up a little bit the resources in terms of these predictions. Yeah, I mean, I think that's that might be one of the better outcomes, or one of the very good outcomes of your research in terms of practicality. So yeah, have you explored, or is there interest, in institutions to actually take this useful information into account to actually put like plan around this?
Yeah, so I presented two parts of my PhD, the part about how to just estimate length of stay to perhaps have conversations with parents. And I'm involved with Bliss, one of the charities, about how best to promote that. And parents made it very clear to me they didn't want to receive a leaflet with all this information on. They wanted it to come from conversations with their clinicians. So it's I need to work on educating the clinicians for that aspect. The aspect I presented about the different levels of care was more aimed at a commissioning audience about how to plan resources and so on. So I've got some more work to do with the NHS managers about how best to use that, because it's very unclear at the minute about how to cost and resource neonatal care appropriately.
Do you think that it's probably best taking a high dependency maternity because there aren't the special care vets. They can't put them down a level because there isn't one. Or can you change their level by staying in the same bed space?
Yeah, so you can change their level by staying in the same bed space because it relates to the care that they're receiving. But the point you're making is actually still quite an important one, because actually some of the differences in length of stay I think are explained by the fact that some areas of the country you'll be discharged home earlier because there's nurses in the community that can care for these babies, but some areas of the country don't have that kind of team at all. Now, it doesn't necessarily explain the differences in high dependency. I did approach that area of the country and actually asked them, and they said, well, that's exactly what we'd expect because we have lots of babies that have been operated on, and so we keep them for quite a long time. So it may be something like that. So that's why I say it's not necessarily a bad thing that they have a different length of stay. It might just be that they have a very different population of babies to look after. I didn't look at that, but that would be very interesting to look at.
Question one?
Just curious about, besides education, that is towards research and further enhancement. Current this research is more beneficial towards the medical authorities or departments or the public awareness. Would contribute more there or towards public research?
I think a bit of both, really. So I think it's important for the medical community to know about things like this, but I think there's been a lot more prolific conversation about preterm birth in the last few years. I mean, this morning I saw a news story about Sadiq Khan's now decided to extend maternity leave for women who have preterm babies who work in his council. So I think actually there's quite a wider public conversation going on about this as well, and I think it's important to discuss all these things in that context.
So we're going to call a halt to this one, and we're going to shamelessly take a photograph so that you can use all kinds of advertising. So this is for you. So congratulations.